So today we're talking about personality, and personality is something that everybody knows a little something about. Lay people know about personality because that's how we identify each other to one another. It's how we identify ourselves. What's consistent about us is what makes us feel like there is an identifiable pattern that we can rely upon. That's what personality in essence is. It's an individual's unique assortment of stable behavior patterns or stable traits that are more or less going to be exhibited across situations and across lifetime, although they're not written in stone. And as we'll see when we get to social psychology, situations can have profound impacts on our behavior such that we act inconsistent with what other people might think to be our behavior traits or characteristics. And as you saw with intelligence, there were lots and lots of different theories of intelligence, and likewise, and maybe even more so, there are lots and lots of theories of personality. And if you take a class in personality, you will find very quickly that there isn't a consensus of what it is exactly any more than there's a consensus of exactly what intelligence is. But we know way more than we used to know because we are a science. Now, we started out with Freud, who's probably the most famous of all people associated with psychology, though he wasn't a psychologist per se. He was not a scientist. He was a theorist, and he was a physician, and he practiced in his time, which was a male-dominated time, a white-dominated time, in a middle-class area of Vienna. And so his patients were largely middle-class or upper-class Viennese women whom he saw in a clinical practice for having issues dealing with life. And he worked with some other people. He became famous in his own time, but he largely developed his own independent theory of personality, accounting for everything in a person's life and how it develops very early on personality and then affects the rest of life there forward in a very deterministic way. So from a philosophical perspective, he was a determinist. And his ideas, as we'll see, are very controversial. They hold lots of concepts within them that people find aversive. And the thing about Freud is to keep him in context, not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but science has thrown out a lot of his concepts since he came up with them. But his concepts were very logically sound concepts based upon some pretty rigid biases he had. So he had biases against women, especially because he was from a male-dominated patriarchal time. He thought they were inferior, and he sought to explain that through processes of development. He also thought that your personality is pretty much fixed by the time you were in your teens, and that would dominate who you were to be for the rest of your life, and that while we might give you a little insight, we wouldn't hold out much hope for a lot of change for you. So in the sense that he felt like who you were was fixed, we later find out that's not the case in social situations that are very powerful, but we also find out that all of us can change, and all of us can change profoundly if we want to change. So we start out with Freud, paying some homage to him, but realizing that while he started the field and did so in a very powerful way, his biggest contribution to understanding personality scientifically was really to piss a bunch of people off. A lot of people just disagreed with him flatly. They thought he was off the mark and way off the mark. Well, it's one of the reasons he was so controversial. He talked a lot about sexuality, something that just wasn't talked about in the early 1900s, and how that played into everybody's experiences. But most people misunderstood what he was saying when he was talking about sexuality. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But he was talking about being fixed in your personality when you're very young, that your unconscious drives a lot of your conscious behaviors, and that sex had a lot to do with who you were and how you were motivated, and that we had these really negative impulses inside us that society really represses and presses down and molds into a functional member. And all of that was really not received well by many people. Some people, on the other hand, thought that he was really a genius and that he was onto something that nobody else had ever tapped into fully or really tried to understand or given credence to. And so he had some very devout adherents. And those people and the people who opposed Freud then engaged in lots of research to prove him right or to prove him wrong. And as such, the field advanced because of the impetus he provided in just simply laying out his systematic theory. So keeping in mind that we take him with a grain of salt, let's go through Freudian psychoanalysis on an introductory level and see what we can learn from it. And you will resonate with some of this and you will recognize some of it. So, psychoanalytic theory starts with 3 levels of mind: the conscious, the preconscious or subconscious, and the unconscious. Now, we're all sharing consciousness right now at varying levels. Some people are daydreaming and they're not really present with us, but they're awake and they're upright, and in that sense they're conscious. And what they're experiencing in their fantasies or daydreams, just drifting off, is their conscious experience at the moment. In other words, they could describe it, they could relate it to other people, they could shift it and bring it back to me and attend to what we're talking about. But we all have that shared experience that this is a classroom, and this is America, and this is a particular time of the day, and a particular time of the month, and a particular year, and we all share that reality because we're all conscious individuals. That much everybody can agree on. We are conscious creatures. Where does that consciousness come from? If you think back to when we were talking about functionalism and William James, and he was talking about a stream of consciousness, that it's just kind of this ongoing thing, and you can never stop thinking. Well, where does your next thought come from? It's coming. There's no doubt about it. It's coming. You're going to have a thought in a second, in another second, in a minute, in another minute, and you don't have to think, what am I going to think next? It just happens. So the idea is, where does that next thought come from? And that would be your subconscious from a Freudian point of view, that it's kind of bubbling up from where? Potentially from an unconscious source. Now, the unconscious source is a very hard thing for a lot of people to grapple with and lend credence to, because by definition, you're not aware of it. So how could anything you're unaware of have any influence over the things you are aware of? And moreover, Freud thought it had the most influence on your moment-to-moment experience in ways that, because you aren't aware of, you can't modify or change, which is why he feels that your early experiences that shape that unconsciousness inside of you are so deterministic, that they will have continued influences over you because you aren't aware of them. If you would like to change them, you'd have to become aware of them. You would have to develop insight. You'd have to then work very hard to become conscious of something that is typically beyond your own awareness, and then that is going to be very difficult to change because it's deep down inside of you. In a way, we're all universes to ourselves. We're all worlds to ourselves, and we let each other know certain things about ourselves on the surface, but there's stuff within us that we don't even understand. Most people can grant that much, but he would say the unconscious is the biggest influence on our moment-to-moment behavior, and that by itself is pretty controversial. Then he talks about 3 divisions of mind. And in these divisions of mind, we have the id. The id you've probably heard of. There's a cartoon, The Wizard of Id. Id consciousness. Well, id is not really conscious. Id is an experience that drives us. Id is a part of our psyche, and it is primitive. It has base drives, animalistic drives, very primal wishes and wants, and it dominates in early childhood, and it operates on the pleasure principle of immediate gratification. So, looking at children developing, young children tantrum very easily because they want what they want when they want it, without regard to any other consequences or any other considerations of other people, because they want it. Well, that's the idea of the id. The id is a life force. It is a driving, motivating factor in our lives. And early on, it's unchecked. It just does what it does because it is the primal operating force. It's the libido. It's where the libido is housed. You probably heard libido. It's a part of popular culture now. It's in songs. It's in Nirvana songs, an old Young MC song. Go to the church in my new tuxedo, check your libido. Libido, what is it? It's a life force. It is a motivational drive within oneself, and in some ways it has sexual characteristics to it. Now, when we talk about sexual characteristics in a Freudian sense, that does not negate sex as most people think about it, where we are talking about sexual behavior, but for him we're really talking about sexual behavior as a progenitor of the species, that we are all primally driven to mate to continue the species. Without mating, We cease to exist. We become extinct. And in that sense, it's a driving force for humanity. It's one that in his day was never talked about. Therefore, it was extremely controversial to just start talking about it. So the life force drives us to survive and to procreate and to ensure that our offspring continue on, so to ensure their survival. To show you how interesting Freud's mind was, in my way of thinking, he did not initially have a death force. It almost sounds like a Star Wars concept. He modified his theories as he encountered new information in his own life. His theories were expansive, many, many, many volumes. Very tight logic, not scientific. That's the difference between just common sense or thinking well or thinking systematically and then finding evidence to support those notions. But he was faced with seeing World War I, which was the war to end all wars. It was a level of violence that was unparalleled and unprecedented. War was not unprecedented, but war on that scale was unprecedented. And so if you have a life force, and that's your primary driving instinct, well then how could you go out and risk dying for a cause or for a country or whatever the case may be? It would try to promote your survival. But here we are in mass seeing destruction, laying waste to entire landscapes, entire sections of humanity. What drives that destructiveness in people, he would say, would be thanatos, the death force. And that causes for him all acts of aggression and destruction. So what we'll see pretty early on with Freud is that he's got a lot of theories that explain a lot of things retrospectively. So if I saw somebody engage in an act of aggression or destruction, vandalism, whatever the case may be, I could go, well, that was their thanatos in operation. But it doesn't help me predict future behavior, right? So it's not a piece of knowledge that allows me to make predictions. And in that sense, it's not really scientific. I can't put it to the test. It's hard to operationalize what is a thanatos, what is a libido, and how do I test libido or test thanatos. And somebody who's high in thanatos should be more aggressive or more destructive, and somebody who's lower in it and higher in libido should be more proactive and positive, etc. Maybe, depending on how you define this, but it defies scientific description. The primary process then is the notion that you can't always get what you want. To quote some famous lyrics by the Rolling Stones, and when you can't get what you want, it's not that that notion goes away, it's not that the desire goes away, the thing that you want so badly but can't get, that drive to get it still exists, and the primary process then allows you to create fantasies and daydreams to gratify that desire, at least mentally and somewhat emotionally, by engaging in fantasy. And the fantasy doesn't necessarily have any realistic means to achievement. If there was a realistic means, you would just gratify the wish or the want in that early stage of life. So you have a kid who's tantruming here. I want a cookie, I want a cookie, I want a cookie. Right? They don't respond to reason. You say, well, you can't have a cookie because it's about dinner time and that'll spoil your dinner, and first you need to eat a healthy meal, and then if you have room you might have some dessert. They don't respond to that because the id's driving the ship at that point. It's what's in control, and it doesn't respond to reason. But you don't get what you want, and so not getting it, you can still go, well, I want a cookie. You get sent to your room or you get spanked or whatever because you're tantruming. You're still ruminating on wanting that cookie, and you're fantasizing about having it perhaps.